when safeguards became shackles. They were designed to protect the system, to slow damage, to prevent collapse. But over time, the very safeguards meant to preserve stability began to do something unexpected. They restricted movement, amplified pressure, and quietly turned safety into constraint. To understand why this matters, we have to revisit a moment when protection stopped feeling optional and started feeling mandatory. After repeated crises, new rules were layered onto the financial system with precision and urgency. Capital buffers grew. Liquidity requirements tightened. Oversight expanded. Each change made sense. Each addressed a real failure. Together, they promised a future where collapse would be harder to trigger. At first, the results looked undeniable. Institutions appeared stronger. Shocks were absorbed more easily. Markets recovered faster. The memory of chaos faded, replaced by confidence in structure. Stability no longer felt fragile. It felt enforced. But beneath that calm, behavior began to shift. Safeguards were no longer treated as emergency measures. They became operating assumptions. Decisions were made with the expectation that buffers would always be there, that rules would always absorb stress before it reached the surface. Protection moved from backup plan to baseline. The early signs were subtle. Balance sheets grew heavier. Flexibility narrowed. Institutions optimized around compliance rather than adaptability. The system became safer on paper, but stiffer in motion. When conditions changed, it responded not with adjustment, but with resistance. The reveal was uncomfortable. Safeguards had not failed. They had succeeded too well. By constraining behavior uniformly, they reduced the system's ability to respond creatively under pressure. What once provided resilience began to limit it. This was not recklessness. It was dependence. Dependence on rules designed for yesterday's crises, applied to tomorrow's uncertainty. And when protection becomes rigid, it stops protecting, it starts binding. The conflict was forming quietly, embedded in structure rather than sentiment, and its consequences would only appear when the system was tested again. As safeguards tightened, the system began to behave differently under stress. Where it once bent, it now resisted. Rules that demanded strength in calm periods left little room for flexibility when conditions shifted. What had been designed as buffers increasingly felt like boundaries. Institutions responded by standardizing behavior. Capital was allocated conservatively. Liquidity was hoarded. Risk appetite narrowed across the board. These changes improved resilience on the surface, but they also synchronized responses. When uncertainty rose, everyone reacted the same way, at the same time. This uniformity carried a hidden cost. Markets rely on diversity of action to function smoothly. Buyers and sellers, risk takers and risk avoiders. Balance emerges from difference. But when safeguards dictate similar constraints for all participants, difference erodes. The system grows orderly but brittle. The pressure showed up in unexpected places. Lending slowed even when demand was healthy. Markets became shallow during stress, not because assets were weak, but because participants were restricted. Liquidity existed, but it could not move freely without violating rules meant to preserve safety. Regulators faced a paradox. The very measures that prevented excess now risked amplifying downturns. Relaxing them could appear irresponsible. Enforcing them strictly could intensify stress. The system required judgment, but judgment had been replaced by thresholds and triggers. This was the early conflict sharpening. Safeguards no longer just absorbed shocks. They shaped behavior in ways that reduced adaptability. Stability was being enforced mechanically rather than cultivated dynamically. Participants sensed a constraint but struggled to articulate it. Everything was compliant. Everything was within limits. Yet the system felt tense, as if it were holding its breath. Movement was possible, but only in narrow channels. The reveal continued to deepen. Safety had become static, and static systems struggle when reality moves. The question was no longer whether safeguards worked. It was whether they allowed the system to function when conditions changed. The tension reached its peak when stress finally arrived, not as a catastrophe, but as a familiar disruption. Something the system should have been able to absorb. Yet instead of adjusting smoothly, it seized. The rules activated in unison. Constricting movement at the exact moment flexibility was required. Liquidity dried up not because capital was absent, but because capital was locked behind requirements. Institutions hesitated to deploy reserves, knowing they would immediately breach thresholds designed for safety. What was meant to protect stability now discouraged participation. Acting felt risky. Waiting felt safer. This was the heart of the conflict. Safeguards had transformed from shock absorbers into pressure points. Every rule tightened simultaneously, magnifying stress rather than dispersing it. The system behaved predictably, and that predictability became dangerous. Markets reflected the strain instantly. Prices gapped. Volatility spiked. Transactions slowed, not because participants panicked, but because they were constrained. The system was compliant, yet dysfunctional. Decision-makers faced an uncomfortable realization. Stability could not be enforced solely through rigidity. Safety required discretion. Rules designed to protect the system needed the ability to bend, not just hold. The emotional peak arrived in the recognition that the system's strength had become its weakness. The safeguards had succeeded in preventing excess, but at the cost of adaptability. When stress arrived, there was no room to maneuver. Intervention became inevitable, not to add more rules, but to suspend them selectively. Relief measures were introduced to restore movement. Thresholds were relaxed. Flexibility was reintroduced from the outside. The buildup had reached its breaking point. The system could not continue bound by its own protections. Something had to give, and it did. The resolution came through a quiet reversal, not an abandonment of safeguards, but a recognition of their limits. Authorities stepped in to loosen constraints temporarily, allowing the system to move again. Liquidity flowed not because fear disappeared, but because participation was no longer punished by rigid rules. The climax revealed a difficult truth. Protection without flexibility is control, and control, when applied uniformly, can suffocate the very system it intends to preserve. Safeguards had not been wrong. They had simply been incomplete. In the aftermath, thinking shifted. Rules were redesigned with built-in discretion. Stress buffers became dynamic rather than static. The system learned to treat safety as a range, not a fixed line. Resilience came to mean the ability to adjust under pressure, not just endure it. The experience reshaped trust. Participants no longer assumed safeguards would hold automatically. They understood that stability required judgment, coordination, and the willingness to adapt rules when reality demanded it. The lesson endured. Systems protected too tightly lose the freedom to respond. Systems left too loose invite chaos. Stability lives in the space between. When safeguard became shackles, the system learned something essential. Safety must protect movement, not prevent it. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future. When